Welcome to the Book Binge. I am your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and after a third month of Discworld reading down, a third Discworld review is coming right up. Today we're talking about Equal Rites by Terry Pratchett, of course the third published book within the Discworld series. In May and in June so far this year, I read The Color of Magic and The Light Fantastic, respectively, and also reviewed each book in the same month. The same thing is happening here. I read Equal Rites in early July, and now late July I'm reviewing it. So check out the Discworld playlist up there for my reviews of the other books if you're interested in. Right now, we're going to talk about the third book. Let's start off just as I normally do with all of my reviews with the good of Equal Rites, and I think the main thing to note with this particular book is that it is more plot-centric and in a sense more character-focused as well. If you weren't particularly into the very humor-forward, punchline-heavy nature of the first two books, Equal Rites definitely shifts gears into much more heavily, like I said, plot and even character-focused story rather than those first two books. It focuses more heavily on those things rather than just on the sheer zaniness. It does have something going on that is not just a little bit easier to follow, but also a lot more, comprehensible. I guess that is, along the lines of easier to follow, but it's generally a lot more sensible of a novel. It is more of a novel than the first two books, which, generally speaking, probably feel a little bit more like proofs of concepts within the series, especially as far as the humor and stuff goes, whereas this book is definitely got more of a story. Like, if you wanted me to actually tell you what happens in The Color of Magic or The Light Fantastic, I'm not sure I could really do so very coherently, whereas Equal Rites definitely has, a plot that you can explain and do so rather coherently, like I said. So in that sense, those are definitely the standout features of Equal Rites. If that's something a little bit more what you're looking for, that's what sets this apart. It makes it a lot more bearable of experience. I know some people who tried reading the first one or two books weren't necessarily super into it, haven't given more Discworld a shot in the time since then, and I think that Equal Rites might be a little bit better of a fit. Now, whether that's necessarily the best starting place per se, I'm not so sure, but it is arguably a better book than The Color of Magic is, for example. Furthermore, another good thing about Equal Rites is that it starts to try to do a little bit more with some implicit thematic content alongside the plot and character stuff, right? As the title suggests, Equal Rites, even though that is a pun with the way that it is spelled, there's some exploration of magic in a gender role type of context that I think is handled actually quite well. This makes up the bulk of both the story and the character focus as it happens, and honestly, sensibly so. That is the title of the book, and that does make for a pretty interesting experience. I think that it is pretty well done. Within the context of that specifically, basically what Equal Rites is about is the fact that wizard magic and witch magic are a little bit different, and what that actually means for anybody who's attempting to go into either one or both of them, right? So men basically study wizard magic, women study witch magic. Each kind of disparages the other from a cultural perspective. However, a girl is born within the world and is accidentally made implicitly into a wizard, right? She's given the birthright of wizard magic, basically, and she has to figure out how to tackle that, and also tackles it alongside another witch character who, has to go through her own kind of journey right along these topics. So as such, shenanigans definitely ensue throughout the book, and as if I really need to spell that out for a Discworld book, but I just loved the dynamic and the dichotomy of that primary thematic ideal, right? Who you are does not necessarily define what you can do with your life, and also at the same time, what you do with your life does not necessarily change who you are. These things aren't mutually exclusive. So what if you're a girl wizard? Again, these things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive things, and the exploration of that within this book, I think, is actually quite solid. And then beyond all of these general points of what the book is doing on a more macro sense, I do think, well, I mean, ironically, this is almost a more macro sense, but anyway, the world building of Equal Rites is also dedicatedly pretty solid, right? Where the first two books definitely kind of throw ideas at the wall in some places, for better or for worse, depending on the context. There are some things that appear in Color of Magic that are basically retconned in the Light Fantastic, for example, because some of those ideas just got changed and were turned into something different instead. Equal Rites is similar to the story and everything like that. It's a little bit more coherent. It's a little bit easier to follow. There's a new location that is built rather enjoyably, and then it also gives a somewhat new perspective, a new exploration of a couple of familiar locales, like the Unseen University makes another appearance and returns in more fun ways, and a couple specific locations within are given a little bit more detail in Equal Rites. And then the world itself, the explanation of the world, basically as one final positive point to give to Equal Rites for the purposes of this review, the opening couple pages of this book, as far as explaining what the Discworld is, are the best opener of the 3 books thus far. That means, like I said, the introduction to the actual Discworld is the best here. Those first couple pages were really, really great. Moving into the bad of Equal Rites, however, I do think that there are a couple of things lost by the shift to focus in Equal Rites. Now, this is, of course, coming from the experience of somebody who's reading the series in publication order. Read the first 2 books already. Those 2 are very humor punchline heavy, like I suggested earlier in this review. But to say that Equal Rites drops the jokes and the punchlines is almost a little bit of an understatement. You know, outside of those opening pages, which are hilarious, there are far fewer quips in this book compared to the first 2. I didn't really find myself pausing to highlight things, whether those be jokes or even more thoughtful quotes, nearly as much within this book, basically. You know, there are definitely a fair few chuckles and the like that still exist here, but nowhere like the first couple of books. So kind of tonally, things are a little bit different, and I think I personally preferred the tone of the first 2 a little bit more than this one. You know, that's not to say that the plot and the character focus of Equal Rites is necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. It just happens to be a little bit of a different focus is all, right? So this change wasn't my particular preference per se, but many other people may actually feel the exact opposite and connect a little bit more with this book than they did with either of the first 2. On a more technical level as well, I also found a good bit of the climax of this book somewhat less engaging and kind of hard to follow, a little bit harder to picture, at least compared to the end of the Light Fantastic, where that climax, the last like 100 pages of that book is really, really good. The last like 80 pages of Equal Rites is basically the climax of this, and I just found it a little bit harder to be as engaged. That's definitely more of a personal preference thing. I'm not saying that this is a bad climax. It by no means is that, but there were definitely moments of it that I found harder to follow, and so was personally less engaged. I think that that might translate into some other readers' experience as well. Not entirely sure. I also found the focus of it a little bit strange, right? So the 2 main characters of this book are Esk, who's the little girl, and then Granny, who's the witch. And these 2 characters definitely both have prominent roles throughout the book, but it feels like Esk is meant to be the main character of the book, but most of the climax came from Granny's POV rather than Esk's, and from a plot perspective this made sense, but was something that I just also enjoyed a little bit less about the climax. Maybe that's why I found certain parts of it a little bit harder to follow, was just because the focus, the POV character, was one that I wasn't as much wanting for the climax, or wasn't expecting, given the seemingness of the main character. That sentence didn't make any sense, but you know what I mean. But even so, that is something that I guess I find worth noting. You know, Esk is the main character of the book. She's not the main character of the climax. But like I suggested a little bit earlier, that is going to take us into the ugly of the book, and that is regarding Esk's character primarily. I have heard it said that Esk doesn't really have a major role in this series. Now, of course, this does basically make sense, right? Discworld is made up of predominantly all standalones for the most part, and even within certain sub-series, as they've been deemed within the books, you have certain recurring characters and stuff that do appear, but not necessarily in a sense of like continuing a narrative, right? So that's not something that I'm expecting here, but if there is any one character within the series so far that I want to see appear more often than I've been told is going to happen. It is Esk, so I feel a little bit sad about that, because you have a really great main character in Esk in this book. I feel like she has a lot of potential to do some cool things in the series, and like maybe that does happen in her brief appearances in some random books later in the series. But I will say that, personally speaking, this is an ugly point for me, because, man, I really want to have a lot more of Esk's character within, say, the Witches subset of books, or even in the Wizard subset of books, given she's a girl wizard. Maybe that happens, maybe it doesn't, but I have been told that she doesn't have as major of a role as I would probably kind of want to see within some of the sub-series, so... You know, that's just a personal thing, right? I wonder if I will overall feel bad about certain characters not reappearing more and more as I go throughout the series. Who knows? Maybe that'll be a major problem. Maybe it won't. I don't know. In the case of Equal Rites, it did introduce me to maybe my favorite character in the series so far, so I'm a little bit sad and perhaps butthurt or salty that she won't be a major character throughout us all. That's, like I said, that's definitely just a personal point. But as we come to the recommendation for Equal Rites, Book 3 of Discworld, well, if you want something a little bit more traditional and plot and character forward, definitely read this book, especially within the context of Discworld. This is the most plot and character forward of the 3 books so far, so it's pretty easy to recommend on that side of things. And furthermore, if you are going to pick this up, do not go into it expecting a super similar tone to the first 2, because I do think it is a shockingly different tone from the first couple of books. Not just in that it is not as much humor, and not just that the plot focus and whatnot is different, but it does have a somewhat different tone just in general, and like that speaks to, you know, a strength on Pratchett's part, being able to differentiate already so much just between the first couple books and this one, but it is definitely something a little bit different, something to be aware of if you're going to give it a try. I'm glad that I knew about this ahead of time, knew about the tonal change, knew that this wasn't going to be as humor forward ahead of time, but even so, I will admit I was slightly disappointed by it. As far as the Witches books goes, this is apparently the most reserved one there. You know, it only features Granny, whereas the future books have a few more fan favorite characters that get included, so I am excited to read more Witches books. It is one of the more popular sub-series within a Discworld. I think probably the City Watch and Witches books are probably the 2 most popular, I think, question mark? I don't know about that. That's just kind of the impression I've got. But as an introduction to some of the concepts within this sort of sub-series, it is a really fun book, and I can't wait to read more of that. Can't wait to read more of the series, and that's going to be happening very, very soon. So yeah, I basically recommend Equal Rites, but just go into it expecting something a little bit different than the prior 2 books. As for the ranking so far of the series, it's a little bit harder to say what exactly this looks like at the moment, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that The Light Fantastic is still my favorite book with a 4 out of 5 rating at the moment. The Equal Rites is probably number 2 with a 3.5 out of 5 rating, and then Color of Magic at number 3 with a 3 out of 5 rating. And as far as like general preference goes, I do think I slightly prefer Color of Magic over this, just because I liked that tone a little bit more, but Equal Rites is a better book, so that is worth noting. That is my ranking, that is my rating so far, and do be aware as I continue reading the series, all of these rankings and even the ratings are subject to change. It'll change. I'll probably do this at the end of every Discworld review, and it is going to change every time. So yeah, that is basically the end of this review. Next month in August, basically at the time of this video's release here in a couple of weeks, essentially, I am going to be reading, when does this video actually come out? On July 28th? Okay, so like next week, basically, I'm going to be reading Mort, the 4th book of the series, which I'm really, really excited for. I have a lot of friends who told me that like Mort would probably be the first book that I loved in the series, but considering that I've already really enjoyed these first few, and I definitely really enjoyed The Light Fantastic, that one's like the closest to coming to having loved the book, right? Mort, I'm really excited to give a shot, see if that holds true, and then in a couple months after that, the next Witches book, Weird Sisters, is going to be read in a few months from now as well, so, you know, keep on the lookout for all of that. But for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe, you can call me Casey, and I hope to see you guys in the next video, whatever that may be.